When I pulled that faded green recipe box from the back of my grandmother's closet 3 days after her funeral, I thought I was just collecting memories. The box was heavier than I expected, filled with handwritten index cards stained with decades of cooking adventures. I could still smell her kitchen on them: cinnamon, vanilla, and that particular scent of love that only comes from a grandmother's cooking. What I didn't expect was to find a manila envelope tucked beneath her famous sugar cookie recipe, sealed with my name written in her careful cursive. Inside that envelope was a truth so shocking it would completely rewrite everything I thought I knew about my family, my identity, and the woman who raised me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Rebecca, and I'm 28 years old, living in a small apartment in Richmond, Virginia, working as a high school English teacher. I've always been the type of person who finds comfort in routine, in the familiar rhythm of lesson plans and grading papers. My grandmother Eleanor had been the steady constant in my life since I was 7, when my parents died in a car accident on a rainy Tuesday evening. She stepped in without hesitation, transforming her quiet retirement into a second round of motherhood, complete with soccer practices, bedtime stories, and endless patience for a grieving child who asked too many questions. Eleanor was everything you'd want in a grandmother. She wore cardigans in every color, kept peppermints in her purse, and had this incredible ability to make anyone feel like the most important person in the world when they walked into her kitchen. Her house on Maple Street was my sanctuary, filled with the constant aroma of something delicious baking and the soft hum of her favorite jazz records playing in the background. She taught me to cook, to garden, to find joy in simple pleasures, and most importantly, she taught me that family isn't just about blood, it's about the people who choose to love you every single day. The morning I found the recipe box, I was cleaning out her house with the help of my best friend Amy. We'd been going through Eleanor's belongings for hours, carefully sorting through a lifetime of memories. Each room held treasures and heartaches: her collection of ceramic birds, the quilt she'd made for my high school graduation, stacks of letters I'd written her from college. The recipe box was tucked away in the back of her bedroom closet, behind a stack of photo albums and her winter coats that still smelled like her signature White Shoulders perfume. Amy was in the kitchen packing up Eleanor's china when I opened the box for the first time. The cards were organized exactly as I remembered, alphabetically by category, each one a small piece of culinary history. I smiled as I flipped through them, remembering Saturday mornings spent standing on a step stool beside her, measuring flour and cracking eggs while she told me stories about each recipe's origin. There was her famous apple crisp, the one she made every Thanksgiving. Her chocolate chip cookies that were legendary among my high school friends. The beef stew that had gotten me through countless winter evenings when I was growing up. But it was when I reached the sugar cookie recipe that everything changed. The card was slightly thicker than the others, and as I lifted it, I noticed something underneath. A manila envelope, yellowed with age, with my name written across the front in Eleanor's familiar handwriting. My heart started beating faster as I opened it, my hands trembling slightly as I pulled out the contents. Inside were 3 items that would turn my world upside down. The first was a photograph I'd never seen before, a young woman with dark hair and bright eyes holding a baby. The woman looked strikingly similar to me, but I didn't recognize her. The second was a birth certificate, also unfamiliar, with names I'd never heard before. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. And the third was a letter, folded neatly, that began with words that made my breath catch in my throat. My dearest Rebecca, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and it's time you knew the truth about who you really are and where you came from. I've carried this secret for 21 years, and while it breaks my heart to burden you with it, I know you deserve to know the truth about your real mother. I sat down hard on Eleanor's bed, the envelope's contents scattered around me, my mind reeling. Real mother? What did that mean? My parents had died when I was 7. I remembered them clearly, or at least, I thought I did. My mother had been a nurse named Patricia, and my father had been an accountant named David. They'd died in a car accident, and Eleanor had taken me in. That was the story I'd lived with my entire life. But as I continued reading Eleanor's letter, The foundation of everything I believed about myself began to crumble. According to the letter, Patricia and David Patterson weren't my biological parents. They had been Eleanor's daughter and son-in-law, yes, but I wasn't their child. I was the daughter of a woman named Catherine Mills, and I had been placed in their care when I was just 6 months old through an informal adoption that had never been legally finalized. The letter explained that Catherine had been Eleanor's next-door neighbor 28 years ago, a young single mother who had found herself in a desperate situation. She had been involved with a man who had become increasingly violent and controlling, and when she discovered she was pregnant, she knew she had to protect her unborn child. Eleanor had helped her through the pregnancy, and when I was born, Catherine had made the heartbreaking decision to give me to Eleanor's daughter Patricia, who had been struggling with infertility for years. According to Eleanor's letter, Catherine had intended for the arrangement to be temporary, just until she could get back on her feet and escape the dangerous situation she was in. But things had gone terribly wrong. The man Catherine had been trying to escape had found out about the baby, and in his rage he had tracked her down. Catherine had disappeared one night, leaving behind only a note begging Eleanor to keep me safe and to never tell anyone the truth about my origins. Eleanor had kept that promise for 21 years. She had watched Patricia and David raise me as their own, had seen them pour their love into me, and had never breathed a word about the truth. When they died in the car accident, Eleanor had stepped in naturally, seamlessly, and had continued to protect the secret even as she became my primary caregiver. The photograph in the envelope was of Catherine holding me as a baby. The birth certificate was my original one, with Catherine Mills listed as my mother and the father listed as unknown. Looking at the photo, I could see the resemblance Eleanor had mentioned in her letter: the same dark hair, the same shape of eyes, the same smile. This woman, who was a complete stranger to me, was actually my biological mother. But the most shocking revelation came in the final paragraph of Eleanor's letter. Catherine hadn't simply disappeared and abandoned me. She had been murdered. The man she had been trying to escape had found her and killed her, and her body had been discovered 3 weeks after she vanished. Eleanor had kept newspaper clippings of the case, which had gone unsolved. The police had never connected Catherine to me, and Eleanor had made sure it stayed that way, terrified that if the truth came out, I might somehow be in danger too. I sat in Eleanor's bedroom for what felt like hours, reading and rereading the letter, staring at the photograph of Catherine, trying to process what I was learning. Everything I thought I knew about my identity, my family, my history, it was all built on a well-intentioned lie. Eleanor had been protecting me, yes, but she had also been keeping me from the truth about who I really was. Amy found me there eventually, still sitting on the bed surrounded by the contents of the envelope. She took one look at my face and knew something was seriously wrong. When I showed her the letter and explained what I'd discovered, she sat down beside me, her own face pale with shock. "Rebecca, this is incredible," she said quietly. "Your grandmother was protecting you all these years. She was keeping you safe from something terrible." But I wasn't sure how to feel about Eleanor's protection. Yes, she had kept me safe, but she had also kept me from knowing my real mother. Catherine had died trying to protect me, and I had grown up not even knowing she existed. I felt grateful to Eleanor for her love and care, but I also felt angry that she had kept such a fundamental truth from me. I felt sad for Catherine, who had died so young and had never gotten to see me grow up. And I felt confused about my own identity. If I wasn't really Patricia and David's daughter, then who was I? The questions swirled in my mind as Amy and I finished packing up Eleanor's belongings. I carefully placed the envelope and its contents in my purse, not sure what I was going to do with the information, but knowing I couldn't just ignore it. As we locked up Eleanor's house for the last time, I looked back at the place that had been my home for so many years, and I realized that even though the building looked the same, everything about it felt different now. It wasn't just Eleanor's house anymore. It was the place where a 21-year-old secret had been kept, where a young woman named Catherine had entrusted her baby to strangers, where Eleanor had made the difficult decision to protect me by hiding the truth. That night, I sat in my own apartment, surrounded by boxes of Eleanor's belongings, and I opened the envelope again. This time, I studied the photograph more carefully, looking for resemblances, for clues about who Catherine had been. I examined the birth certificate, noting the hospital where I'd been born, the date, the doctor's name. And I read Eleanor's letter again, this time focusing on the details she'd included about Catherine's situation, about the man she'd been trying to escape, about the circumstances that had led to my placement with Patricia and David. Eleanor had included one more item in the envelope that I had initially overlooked, a small address book with several entries highlighted in yellow. As I flipped through it, I realized that these were people who had known Catherine, people who might be able to tell me more about my biological mother. There was a woman named Linda Carter, described as Catherine's best friend. There was a man named James Wilson, listed as Catherine's brother. And there was a phone number for someone named Detective Roy Martinez, who had apparently worked on Catherine's case. For the first time since finding the envelope, I felt a spark of hope. Maybe I couldn't bring Catherine back, and maybe I couldn't undo the years of not knowing about her, but I could learn more about who she had been. I could find out about her life, her dreams, her personality. I could connect with people who had known her and loved her, and maybe, in doing so, I could understand more about myself and where I came from. I decided to start with Linda Carter, Catherine's best friend. According to Eleanor's notes, Linda had been the person Catherine had confided in about her situation, and she had been the one to help coordinate my placement with Patricia and David. If anyone could tell me about my biological mother, it would be Linda. It took me 3 days to work up the courage to make the call. When I finally did, my hands were shaking as I dialed the number. A woman answered on the third ring, her voice warm and slightly cautious. "Hello, is this Linda Carter?" I asked. "Yes, who's this?" "My name is Rebecca Patterson. I think you knew my mother, Catherine Mills." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Linda said, "Oh my God, Rebecca, you're Catherine's baby. I wondered if this day would ever come." Linda agreed to meet me the following Saturday at a coffee shop in downtown Richmond. She told me she had been hoping for years that someone would reach out, that she'd never forgotten about Catherine or about me. She said she had stories to tell me, photographs to show me, and most importantly, she had letters that Catherine had written to me, letters that she had never been able to deliver because Catherine had died before she could reclaim me. As I hung up the phone, I felt a mixture of excitement and terror. I was about to learn about the woman who had given birth to me, who had loved me enough to give me a way to keep me safe, who had died trying to protect me. I was about to discover a part of myself that I had never known existed, and I was about to understand why Eleanor had kept this secret for so long, and why she had finally decided to let me know the truth. The photograph of Catherine and me as a baby sat on my kitchen table, and I found myself staring at it constantly over the next few days. I tried to imagine what she had been like, what her voice had sounded like, what her dreams had been. I wondered if she had been a good cook like Eleanor, if she had loved to read like I did, if she had been funny or serious or somewhere in between. I wondered what she would think of the woman I had become, and whether she would be proud of the life I had built for myself. Most of all, I wondered about the sacrifice she had made. She had given up her own child to keep me safe, and then she had died trying to escape the man who had threatened both of us. It was an act of love so profound that I could barely comprehend it, and yet, it was also an act that had shaped my entire life without me even knowing it. Saturday couldn't come fast enough. Saturday morning arrived with a gentle spring rain that matched the nervous energy coursing through my veins. I had barely slept the night before, my mind racing with questions and possibilities about what Linda Carter might tell me about Catherine. I dressed carefully, choosing a simple blue sweater that Eleanor had always said brought out my eyes, and I tucked the envelope containing Catherine's photograph and birth certificate into my purse alongside a small notebook where I planned to write down everything Linda shared with me. The coffee shop Linda had chosen was a cozy place called Roasted Beans, tucked between a bookstore and a flower shop on Main Street. The interior was warm and inviting, with mismatched furniture and local artwork covering the walls. I arrived 15 minutes early, ordering a chai latte and finding a quiet corner table where we could talk privately. My hands trembled slightly as I wrapped them around the warm mug, and I found myself checking the door every few seconds, wondering if I would recognize Linda when she arrived. At exactly 2 o'clock, a woman in her early 50s walked through the door, her auburn hair streaked with silver, and her green eyes scanning the room with purpose. She was wearing a burgundy jacket and carrying a leather messenger bag that looked well-worn and loved. Something about her expression, the way she moved with quiet confidence, told me immediately that this was Linda. Our eyes met across the room, and she smiled, a warm expression that somehow managed to be both sad and hopeful at the same time. "Rebecca," she said as she approached my table, her voice soft but certain. "You look so much like her. The resemblance is remarkable." I stood to greet her, and she pulled me into a gentle hug that surprised me with its familiarity. Linda smelled like vanilla and lavender, a comforting scent that reminded me somehow of home. When we separated, I could see tears gathering in her eyes, and I realized that this meeting was just as emotional for her as it was for me. "I can't believe you're really here," Linda said as we settled into our seats. "I've thought about you so many times over the years, wondered what kind of person you were becoming, whether you were happy, whether you even knew about Catherine. When Eleanor would see me around town, she'd always give me little updates about you, but she never told me you didn't know the truth." This revelation caught me off guard. "You knew Eleanor? You stayed in touch with her?" Linda nodded, pulling a tissue from her bag and dabbing at her eyes. "Richmond isn't that big a place, and Eleanor and I had a connection because of Catherine and you. We'd run into each other at the grocery store or at church functions, and she'd always tell me how well you were doing in school, how proud she was of you. But she never mentioned that you didn't know about Catherine. I just assumed you knew but didn't want to talk about it." I felt a strange mix of emotions hearing this. Eleanor had been getting updates about me to share with Linda, creating a secret connection between my two mothers' worlds that I had never known existed. It was both touching and unsettling to realize how many people had known about my true origins, while I had remained completely in the dark. "Linda, I need to know everything," I said, leaning forward across the table. "Eleanor's letter told me the basics, but I want to know who Catherine was as a person. What was she like? What did she love? What were her dreams?" Linda's face softened as she began to speak about her friend. Catherine was one of those people who lit up every room she entered. She had this infectious laugh, this way of making everyone around her feel special and heard. She was incredibly creative, always painting or writing poetry or coming up with elaborate dinner parties for our group of friends. She worked at the local library, and she loved it because she got to help people find exactly the book they were looking for. She always said books were like matchmakers, bringing the right story to the right person at the right time. As Linda spoke, I found myself taking notes, trying to capture every detail about this woman who had given me life. Catherine had worked at the library, just like I had during college. She had loved books and literature, which explained my own passion for English and teaching. She had been creative and social, qualities I recognized in myself but had always attributed to Eleanor's influence. "She was also incredibly brave," Linda continued. "When she found out she was pregnant with you, she was terrified but also determined to do right by you. The man she had been involved with, Marcus, he was charming at first, but he became increasingly controlling and violent. Catherine tried to leave him multiple times, but he always found ways to manipulate her into coming back. When she realized she was pregnant, she knew she had to protect you from him." Linda reached into her messenger bag and pulled out a small photo album, its cover worn soft with age. "I brought some pictures of Catherine, if you'd like to see them." My heart raced as she opened the album and began showing me photographs of my biological mother. There were pictures of Catherine at various ages, from her teenage years through her early 20s. In every photo, she was smiling, often with her arms around friends or family members. There were pictures of her at work at the library, surrounded by books and helping patrons. There were photos of her painting at an easel in what appeared to be a small apartment, her dark hair pulled back in a messy bun and her face concentrated in artistic focus. But it was the final section of the album that made my breath catch. These were pictures of Catherine during her pregnancy with me. In one photo, she was standing in profile, her hands resting on her rounded belly, a soft smile on her face. In another, she was sitting in a rocking chair, reading a book to her unborn child. The love in her expression was unmistakable, and I realized that even though she had been planning to give me away, she had loved me deeply during the months she carried me. "She talked to you constantly when she was pregnant," Linda said, noticing my focus on these particular photos. "She would read to you, sing to you, tell you stories about the world you were going to enter. She wanted you to know her voice, even if she couldn't be the one to raise you. I wiped away tears that had started flowing without my notice. Did she ever regret the decision to place me with Patricia and David? Linda was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. Catherine loved you more than life itself, Rebecca. The decision to place you with Patricia and David was the hardest thing she ever had to do. But she never regretted it because she knew it was the right choice for you. She wanted you to have a stable, loving home with two parents who could give you everything she couldn't provide while she was trying to escape Marcus. Linda reached back into her bag and pulled out a small wooden box, its surface polished smooth with age. This was Catherine's, and she wanted you to have it when you were older. I've been keeping it safe for 28 years, waiting for the right moment to give it to you. I opened the box with trembling hands. Inside were several items that provided an intimate glimpse into Catherine's life and personality. There was a small silver locket with a picture of me as a newborn inside, a collection of poems she had written during her pregnancy, a pressed flower from what appeared to be a garden she had tended, and a series of letters addressed to me in her careful handwriting. She wrote you letters? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Linda nodded. She wrote you one letter every week during her pregnancy, and then she continued writing to you after you were born. She planned to give them to you when you were older, when you might have questions about why she had made the choices she did. There are over 30 letters in there, Rebecca. 30 letters from your mother, telling you about her life, her hopes for you, her dreams about the woman you would become. I carefully lifted one of the letters from the box, noting the date on the envelope. It was written when I was 3 months old, and it was addressed to my dearest Rebecca. The paper was slightly yellowed with age, and I could see that Catherine had written in blue ink, her handwriting neat and deliberate. Would it be okay if I read one now? I asked Linda. Of course, they're yours, Rebecca. They've always been yours. I opened the letter carefully, my hands shaking as I unfolded the pages. Catherine's words reached across 28 years to touch my heart. My dearest Rebecca, today you are 3 months old, and I got to hold you for a few precious hours while Patricia was at a doctor's appointment. You have grown so much since I last saw you, and you smiled at me today, a real smile that made my heart soar. I know you don't know who I am, and I know that Patricia and David are your parents in every way that matters, but I want you to know that I love you with every fiber of my being. I sing you the same lullaby every night before I go to sleep, the one I sang to you when you were in my womb. I hope somehow you can hear it and know that your first mother is thinking of you always. The letter continued for 3 pages, with Catherine describing her daily life, her work at the library, her hopes for my future, and her gratitude to Patricia and David for giving me the love and stability she couldn't provide. She wrote about watching me from a distance sometimes, seeing me in the grocery store with Patricia, or playing in the park with David, and how proud she was of the happy, healthy baby I was becoming. I couldn't read the entire letter without crying, and Linda handed me tissues while I composed myself. She loved you so much, Rebecca. Even though she couldn't be your mother in the traditional sense, she never stopped loving you or thinking about you. What happened to her? I asked, dreading the answer but knowing I needed to hear it. Eleanor's letter said she was murdered, but there weren't many details. Linda's expression grew somber. Marcus became increasingly unstable after Catherine left him. He couldn't accept that she had ended their relationship, and he became obsessed with finding her and bringing her back. Catherine had been staying with different friends, trying to keep moving so he couldn't track her down. She was working on getting a restraining order, but the legal process was slow. Linda paused, clearly struggling with the painful memory. One night, about 6 months after you were born, Marcus showed up at the apartment where Catherine was staying. He had somehow found out her location, and he was drunk and angry. There was a confrontation, and Marcus killed her. The neighbors heard the argument and called the police, but they arrived too late. I felt sick to my stomach hearing the details of Catherine's death. This woman who had given me life, who had loved me enough to sacrifice her own happiness for my safety, had died because of the very danger she had been trying to protect me from. Was Marcus arrested? I asked. Linda shook her head. He ran after he killed her, and the police couldn't find him. The case went cold, and as far as I know, he was never caught. Eleanor was terrified that if anyone connected Catherine to you, Marcus might come looking for you too. That's why she kept the secret for so long. I sat back in my chair, overwhelmed by the weight of what I was learning. My biological mother had been murdered by a man who might still be out there somewhere, and my grandmother had spent 28 years protecting me from a threat I didn't even know existed. Linda, do you think Marcus is still alive? Do you think he might still be dangerous? Linda considered this carefully. Honestly, Rebecca, I don't know. Marcus would be in his 50s now, and it's been almost 28 years. He might be dead, he might be in prison for other crimes, or he might be living somewhere under a different name. But I think Eleanor was right to be cautious. Some people never change, and Marcus was a very dangerous man. We sat in silence for a few minutes, both of us processing the weight of Catherine's story. Finally, Linda reached across the table and took my hand. I want you to know something, Rebecca. Catherine's death wasn't your fault. She didn't die because she had you, she died because she loved you enough to try to protect you. And her sacrifice wasn't in vain, because look at the amazing woman you've become. You're a teacher, which means you're helping other people learn and grow, just like Catherine did at the library. You're kind and thoughtful and brave, qualities I can see that you inherited from her. Linda's words touched me deeply, but I still struggled with feelings of guilt and confusion. I just wish I had known about her sooner. I wish I had been able to thank her for her sacrifice, to tell her that I turned out okay. She knew, Rebecca. Somehow, I think she knew. Catherine had a deep faith, and she believed that love transcends death, that the people we love never really leave us. I think she's been watching over you all these years, proud of every accomplishment, every milestone, every moment of happiness in your life. Linda spent the next hour sharing more memories of Catherine, telling me about her favorite books, her love of gardening, her terrible cooking skills that had been a running joke among their friend group. She showed me more photographs and read excerpts from some of Catherine's poems. By the time we left the coffee shop, I felt like I had a much fuller picture of who my biological mother had been as a person. As we stood outside Roasted Beans, Linda pulled out a piece of paper with several names and phone numbers written on it. These are other people who knew Catherine and loved her. Her brother James, who lives in North Carolina now. Her former co-worker Susan, who still works at the library. Her old neighbor Mrs. Thompson, who helped her during her pregnancy. If you want to learn more about Catherine, these people would be happy to share their memories with you. I took the paper gratefully, adding it to the growing collection of connections to Catherine's life. Linda, thank you for everything, for keeping her memory alive, for saving these letters and photographs, for meeting with me today. This has meant more to me than you could ever know. Linda hugged me goodbye, and I could feel her reluctance to let me go. Rebecca, I want you to know that you don't have to carry this burden alone. If you ever need to talk about Catherine, or if you ever have questions about your family history, I'm here for you. You're not just Catherine's daughter. You're part of a community of people who loved her and who care about you. As I drove home that evening, my mind was reeling with everything I had learned. Catherine had been a real person with hopes and dreams and fears, not just a tragic figure in Eleanor's letter. She had loved books and art and flowers, she had been kind and creative and brave, and she had died trying to protect me from a man who had threatened both of our lives. But along with the sadness of learning about Catherine's death, I also felt a strange sense of completion. For the first time in my life, I understood where certain aspects of my personality had come from. My love of literature wasn't just something I had developed on my own, it was a connection to a mother who had worked in a library and had read to me before I was even born. My artistic tendencies, my empathy for others, my determination to help people learn and grow, these were all gifts from Catherine that I had carried with me without even knowing it. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with Catherine's box of letters spread before me, reading each one carefully and savoring every word. Through her letters, I got to know Catherine as a person, not just as a biological mother. She wrote about her daily life, her hopes for my future, her gratitude to Patricia and David, and her unwavering love for me despite the difficult circumstances of my birth. In one letter, written when I was 6 months old, Catherine described watching me take my first steps in the park while she observed from a distance. She wrote about how proud she was, how much she wanted to run over and scoop me up in her arms, but how she knew that Patricia and David were my real parents, and that her role was to love me from afar. In another letter, written just a few weeks before her death, Catherine wrote about her fears for the future and her hope that someday I would understand the choices she had made. She wrote about wanting to be brave for me, to create a world where I could grow up safe and happy, even if she couldn't be part of that world herself. Reading Catherine's letters was both heartbreaking and healing. I grieved for the relationship we had never been able to have, but I also felt grateful for the love she had shown me in the only way she could. Her letters were a gift that spanned decades, a way for her to mother me even after death. As I prepared for bed that night, I looked at the photograph of Catherine holding me as a baby, and for the first time I felt a real connection to this woman who had given me life. She wasn't just a stranger anymore, she was my mother, and even though she was gone, her love for me lived on in every letter she had written, every sacrifice she had made, and every day of safety and happiness I had been able to experience because of her courage. Tomorrow, I would begin reaching out to the other people Linda had mentioned, continuing to piece together the puzzle of Catherine's life and my own origins. But tonight, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced since finding Eleanor's envelope. I finally knew who I was and where I came from, and I carried within me the love of not just one mother but 3 women who had each played a crucial role in shaping the person I had become. The phone call with James Wilson, Catherine's brother, came 3 days after my meeting with Linda. I had been hesitant to reach out to him, unsure of how to explain who I was, or whether he would even want to speak with me. But Linda had assured me that James had always wondered about me, had always hoped that someday he might be able to connect with his sister's daughter. When I finally worked up the courage to dial his number, his response was immediate and warm. "Rebecca," he said, his voice carrying a slight southern accent that reminded me somehow of Catherine's gentle tone in the recordings Linda had played for me. "I've been waiting for this call for 28 years. I never gave up hope that someday you would find your way back to our family." James lived in Charlotte, North Carolina, about 4 hours south of Richmond, and he invited me to visit him the following weekend. He told me he had boxes of Catherine's belongings that he had been saving for me, photographs and artwork, and personal items that told the story of her life before I was born. He also mentioned that he had been conducting his own quiet investigation into Catherine's murder over the years, following leads and staying in touch with the detective who had worked the case. The drive to Charlotte gave me time to process everything I had learned from Linda and to prepare myself for what James might tell me. I found myself both excited and terrified at the prospect of meeting my uncle, this man who shared Catherine's blood and who had known her in a way that no one else had. I wondered if he would see Catherine in me, if he would be able to fill in more pieces of the puzzle that had become my life. James lived in a modest brick house in a quiet neighborhood filled with oak trees and well-tended gardens. When I knocked on his front door, it was opened by a man in his early 60s, with graying hair and kind eyes that looked remarkably similar to mine. He was taller than I had expected, with the same slender build I had inherited, and when he smiled, I could see traces of Catherine's expression in his face. "You look just like her," he said, pulling me into a warm hug. "Catherine would be so proud of the woman you've become." James led me into his living room, where he had prepared what he called a Catherine shrine. The coffee table was covered with photo albums, scrapbooks, and boxes of memorabilia that chronicled my mother's life from childhood through her death. There were school pictures, artwork from her teenage years, letters she had written to James from college, and personal items that painted a picture of a vibrant, creative woman who had been loved by many people. "I've been collecting these things for almost 30 years, James explained as we settled onto his couch. "After Catherine died, I went to her apartment and saved everything I could. I always hoped that someday I would be able to share her story with you, to help you understand the kind of person she was." The first album James showed me contained photographs of Catherine as a child and teenager. I saw her at birthday parties, family gatherings, school events, and casual moments that captured her personality and spirit. In one photo, she was about 12 years old, standing in front of an easel with paint splattered across her clothes and a huge grin on her face. In another, she was holding a trophy at what appeared to be a science fair, her expression proud and confident. "Catherine was always the artist in the family," James said, pointing to several photos of her with various creative projects. "She could draw, paint, write poetry, play guitar. She had this incredible imagination, and she was always creating something new. She used to say that art was her way of making sense of the world. James showed me some of Catherine's artwork that he had preserved over the years. There were paintings of landscapes and portraits, drawings of flowers and animals, and abstract pieces that seemed to capture emotions and moods in color and form. Her talent was evident in every piece, and I found myself studying her brushstrokes and techniques, looking for connections to my own artistic interests. "She painted this when she was pregnant with you," James said, showing me a canvas that took my breath away. It was a painting of a woman holding a baby, but the faces were abstract, more suggested than defined. The colors were warm and loving, blues and greens and soft yellows that seemed to glow from within. At the bottom of the canvas, Catherine had written, "For my daughter, with all my love." I stared at the painting for a long time, overwhelmed by the realization that Catherine had created this specifically for me. She had painted it during her pregnancy, when she was planning to give me away but still wanted to leave me something that expressed her love. The painting was beautiful and heartbreaking at the same time, a mother's gift to a child she would never be able to raise. "I want you to have this," James said quietly. "Catherine painted it for you, and it should be yours." James spent the next several hours sharing stories about Catherine's childhood and young adulthood. He told me about her love of books and learning, her kindness toward animals and younger children, her determination to help others whenever she could. He showed me letters she had written to him from college, where she had studied English literature and education, planning to become a teacher before life took her in a different direction. "Catherine always wanted to help people," James said. "She volunteered at the animal shelter, tutored kids who were struggling in school, visited elderly people in nursing homes. She had this incredible capacity for empathy, this ability to make everyone feel seen and valued. I recognized these qualities in myself, and I began to understand that my choice to become a teacher wasn't just a career decision, but a reflection of the compassion and desire to help others that I had inherited from Catherine. She had never gotten the chance to become a teacher herself, but in a way, she had passed that calling on to me." The conversation eventually turned to the more difficult aspects of Catherine's life, particularly her relationship with Marcus, and the circumstances that had led to her death. James's expression grew darker as he spoke about the man who had killed his sister. "Marcus was charming at first," James said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "He was older than Catherine, more experienced, and he swept her off her feet. She was young and naive, and she thought his intensity was romantic. But it didn't take long for his true nature to show." James pulled out a folder filled with newspaper clippings, police reports, and notes he had made over the years. "I've been tracking Marcus for almost 3 decades, Rebecca. I've never given up hope that someday he would be found and brought to justice for what he did to Catherine." The police reports made for difficult reading. They documented Marcus's history of violence, his pattern of controlling and abusive behavior, and the escalating threats he had made against Catherine in the weeks before her death. There were restraining orders that had been filed and ignored, witness statements from friends who had seen Catherine's bruises and heard her fears, and evidence of Marcus's obsessive behavior that had made Catherine's life a nightmare. "The night Catherine died, Marcus had been drinking," James continued. "He forced his way into the apartment where she was staying, and according to the neighbors who heard the argument, he was screaming at her to come back to him. When she refused, he killed her in a rage. I felt sick reading the details of Catherine's final moments, but I also felt a burning anger toward the man who had taken her life. Was there never any trace of him after that night?" James shook his head grimly. "Marcus disappeared completely. He had no family in the area? No close friends who would harbor him? No obvious place to run? The police followed every lead they could find, but he seemed to vanish into thin air." James showed me a photograph of Marcus that had been taken shortly before Catherine's death. He was a large man with dark hair and cold eyes, and something about his expression made me feel deeply uncomfortable. This was the man who had killed my mother, who had threatened my safety before I was even old enough to understand danger. "There's something else, Rebecca," James said, his voice becoming more serious. About 3 years ago, I hired a private investigator to look into Marcus's disappearance. We found some evidence that he might still be alive, that he might be living under a different name somewhere in the Midwest. This revelation hit me like a physical blow. The man who had murdered Catherine might still be out there, living his life while she lay in a grave, and I grew up never knowing the truth about my origins. The thought that he had escaped justice for almost 30 years filled me with a rage I had never experienced before. "Do you think he knows about me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. James considered this carefully. "I don't know, Rebecca. Marcus knew. Catherine was pregnant when she left him, but I don't think he knew about the adoption arrangement. Eleanor was very careful to keep your existence secret from anyone who might have connections to Marcus. But if he's still alive, if he's still the obsessive man he was 30 years ago, there's always a chance he might try to find out what happened to Catherine's baby." The weight of this possibility settled over me like a dark cloud. I had come to Charlotte hoping to learn more about Catherine's life, but instead I was discovering that the danger she had died trying to protect me from might still exist. The man who had killed her might still be out there, and if he ever learned about me, I could be in danger too. James seemed to sense my fear and reached over to take my hand. "Rebecca, I don't want you to live in fear. The chances of Marcus finding you, or even caring about you after all these years, are very small. But I think you have a right to know the truth about the situation, and I think you should be careful about your safety." We spent the evening going through more of Catherine's belongings, and James shared more stories about her life and personality. He showed me her high school yearbook, where she had been voted most likely to change the world. He let me read some of her college papers, which demonstrated her intelligence and passion for literature. He played me recordings of her playing guitar and singing, her voice sweet and clear and full of life. But the shadow of Marcus's possible survival hung over everything we discussed. I found myself wondering if Catherine had known, in her final moments, that her sacrifice might not be enough to keep me safe forever. I wondered if she had hoped that by giving me away, she could break the cycle of violence that had defined her relationship with Marcus. That night, I stayed in James's guest room, surrounded by Catherine's artwork and personal belongings. I couldn't sleep, my mind racing with questions and fears and a growing determination to find out the truth about what had happened to Marcus. If he was still alive, if he was still a threat, then I needed to know. I couldn't live my life looking over my shoulder, wondering if the man who had killed my mother might someday come looking for me. The next morning, James showed me the cemetery where Catherine was buried. It was a peaceful place, with rolling hills and mature trees that provided shade for the headstones. Catherine's grave was marked with a simple granite stone that read, "Catherine Mills, beloved daughter and sister, 1967 to 1995. Someone had left fresh flowers, and James explained that he visited her grave regularly, often bringing news about me and updates on his investigation into Marcus's whereabouts. I stood at Catherine's grave for a long time, trying to find words to say to the mother I had never known. I told her about my life, my career as a teacher, my relationship with Eleanor, my gratitude for the sacrifice she had made. I promised her that I would not let her death be in vain, that I would find a way to honor her memory and maybe even find justice for what had been done to her. As James and I prepared to say goodbye, he handed me a business card for the private investigator he had hired. His name is Detective Ray Morrison, and he's retired from the police force, but still works cold cases. He's been looking into Marcus's disappearance, and he's made some progress. If you want to pursue this further, if you want to try to find Marcus and bring him to justice, Ray is the man who can help you." I took the card, feeling the weight of the decision I was facing. I could return to Richmond, go back to my quiet life as a teacher, and try to forget about Marcus and the potential danger he represented. Or I could pursue the truth, try to find the man who had killed Catherine, and maybe finally bring closure to a case that had haunted my family for almost 30 years. The drive back to Richmond gave me time to think about what I wanted to do next. I had learned so much about Catherine over the past week, and I felt a deep connection to her that I had never experienced before. She had been a kind, creative, loving woman who had died trying to protect me, and I felt that I owed it to her memory to pursue justice for her death. But I also felt afraid. Marcus had been a dangerous man 30 years ago, and if he was still alive, he might still be dangerous now. Getting involved in the investigation could put me at risk, could expose me to the very danger that Catherine had died trying to protect me from. When I returned to my apartment that evening, I sat at my kitchen table with Detective Morrison's business card in front of me, and Catherine's letters spread around me. I reread several of the letters, looking for guidance from the mother I had never known. In one letter, Catherine had written about her hopes for my future, her wish that I would grow up to be brave and strong, and willing to stand up for what was right. In another letter, she had written about her own fears and her determination to face them for my sake. She had written about choosing courage over safety, about doing what was right even when it was difficult or dangerous. Reading her words, I felt like Catherine was speaking to me across the decades, encouraging me to be brave just as she had been brave. That night, I made my decision. I would contact Detective Morrison and ask him to help me find Marcus. I would pursue justice for Catherine's death, not just for her sake, but for the sake of all the other women who might be at risk if Marcus was still alive and still dangerous. I would be brave, just as Catherine had been brave, and I would face whatever dangers lay ahead with the same determination she had shown when she chose to protect me. The next morning, I called Detective Morrison and arranged to meet with him later that week. I also called Linda Carter and told her about my visit with James and my decision to pursue the investigation. Linda was worried about my safety, but she also understood my need to find answers and seek justice for Catherine. As I prepared for this next phase of my journey, I felt a strange mixture of fear and determination. I was about to step into a world of danger and uncertainty, but I was also about to honor Catherine's memory in the most meaningful way possible. I was going to fight for justice, just as she had fought to protect me, and I was going to make sure that her sacrifice had not been in vain. Catherine's painting hung on my living room wall, a constant reminder of her love and the courage she had shown in her final months. Every time I looked at it, I felt her presence with me, encouraging me to be strong and brave and to never give up the fight for what was right. I was no longer just Rebecca Patterson, the teacher from Richmond. I was Catherine Mills's daughter, and I was going to make sure that the world knew her story and that justice was finally served for her death. Detective Ray Morrison's office was located in a strip mall between a dry cleaner and a Chinese restaurant, the kind of place that looked unremarkable from the outside but held the weight of countless unsolved mysteries within its walls. When I walked through the door on a humid Thursday afternoon in June, I was greeted by the smell of old coffee and the soft hum of air conditioning struggling against the Virginia heat. The waiting area was sparse but comfortable, with worn leather chairs and filing cabinets that suggested years of dedicated investigative work. Ray Morrison emerged from his inner office within minutes of my arrival, and I was immediately struck by his presence. He was a man in his late 50s, with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His handshake was firm, his demeanor professional but warm, and something about his bearing suggested a man who had spent decades pursuing justice and wasn't easily deterred by obstacles or time. "Rebecca," he said, gesturing toward his office, "James has told me a lot about you over the years. I'm glad you finally decided to reach out." His office was organized chaos, with case files stacked on every available naggers surface and a large whiteboard covered with photographs, timelines, and notes connected by different colored strings. I could see that one section of the board was dedicated to Catherine's case, with her photograph prominently displayed alongside maps, witness statements, and what appeared to be recent investigative findings. "I've been working on your mother's case for over 3 years now," Ray said, settling behind his desk and pulling out a thick folder. "James hired me initially just to see if there were any leads the original investigation might have missed, but what we've found has been much more significant than either of us expected." Ray opened the folder and spread several documents across his desk. "Let me start by telling you what we know about Marcus Dalton's disappearance after Catherine's murder. The original investigation was thorough for its time, but they were working with limited resources and technology. Today we have access to databases, tracking systems, and investigative tools that simply didn't exist in 1995. He pulled out a map of the United States with several locations marked in red. We've been able to trace Marcus's movements in the months following Catherine's death. He initially fled to Florida, where he stayed with a distant cousin for about 6 months. Then he moved to Louisiana, where he worked construction jobs under the name Mark Davidson. From there, he went to Texas, then Oklahoma, always staying in small towns where he could blend in and avoid detection. Ray pointed to a cluster of marks in the Midwest. About 15 years ago, Marcus settled in a small town called Millbrook, Kansas. He's been living there under the name Michael Duncan, working as a mechanic and keeping a very low profile. He's never married, has no close friends, and has managed to stay completely off law enforcement's radar. I stared at the map, my mind struggling to process the information. You're telling me that Marcus has been living a normal life for 15 years while Catherine is dead and buried? Ray nodded grimly. It's more common than you might think. People who commit violent crimes often disappear into small communities where they can reinvent themselves. Marcus has been careful, disciplined, and smart about covering his tracks. If we hadn't been specifically looking for him, he probably would have stayed hidden indefinitely. The injustice of it all hit me like a physical blow. While I had been growing up with Eleanor, going to school, starting my career, and living my life, the man who had murdered my mother had been free, building a new identity, and apparently living without consequences for his actions. The thought made me feel sick and angry at the same time. How certain are you that this Michael Duncan is actually Marcus? I asked. Ray pulled out a series of photographs and documents. We're very certain. We managed to get recent photographs of Duncan, and while he's aged and changed his appearance somewhat, the facial recognition software confirms it's the same person. We also ran his fingerprints through the system when he applied for a job at the garage where he works, and they matched the prints from Catherine's apartment. He showed me a surveillance photo of a man in his 50s with graying hair and a beard, working on a car engine. Even with the changes that 28 years had brought, I could see the resemblance to the younger Marcus in the police files. The same cold eyes, the same strong jaw, the same intimidating presence that had terrified Catherine all those years ago. The question now, Ray continued, is what you want to do with this information. We have enough evidence to prove that Michael Duncan is Marcus Dalton, and we can certainly turn this over to the authorities. But there are some complications we need to discuss. Ray leaned back in his chair and studied my face carefully. The first complication is jurisdictional. Catherine was murdered in Virginia, but Marcus is now living in Kansas. Getting him extradited and brought to trial will involve multiple law enforcement agencies and could take months or even years. The second complication is evidentiary. While we have proof that Duncan is Dalton, some of the evidence from Catherine's original case has been lost or degraded over time. Building a strong prosecution case may be challenging. I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach. Are you saying that even if we find him, he might not be convicted? Ray held up a hand. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that we need to be realistic about the challenges we're facing and make sure we approach this the right way. There are several options we can pursue, and each has its own risks and benefits. He pulled out a legal pad and began outlining the different approaches. Option 1 is to contact the Virginia State Police and the Kansas authorities immediately, provide them with our evidence, and let them handle the arrest and prosecution. This is the most straightforward approach, but it also means we lose control over the timeline and the investigation. Ray flipped to a new page. Option 2 is to gather additional evidence before involving law enforcement. We could conduct more surveillance, interview people who know Duncan, and try to build an even stronger case. This would take more time but might result in a better outcome. He paused and looked at me seriously. Option 3 is more complicated and potentially dangerous. We could approach Marcus directly, confront him with what we know, and try to get him to confess. This would provide the strongest possible evidence for prosecution, but it would also put you at risk. The idea of confronting Marcus face to face terrified me, but it also appealed to something deep inside me. Catherine had never gotten the chance to confront her killer, to tell him what his actions had cost her, and the people who loved her. Maybe it was time for someone to speak for her, to make Marcus face the consequences of what he had done. What would confronting him involve? I asked. Ray leaned forward. We would need to be very careful about how we approached it. Marcus is still a dangerous man, and we can't underestimate what he might do if he feels cornered. But if we could arrange to meet him in a controlled environment, with proper backup and recording equipment, we might be able to get him to admit to Catherine's murder. I thought about Catherine's letters, about her courage in facing Marcus despite knowing the danger he represented. I thought about the sacrifice she had made to protect me, and about the 28 years of freedom that Marcus had stolen from her. I thought about Eleanor, who had carried the weight of this secret for decades, and about James, who had never given up hope that justice would eventually be served. I want to confront him, I said finally. I want to look him in the eye and tell him what he took from me, from all of us. I want to make sure he knows that Catherine is not forgotten, that her death has not been swept under the rug. Ray studied me for a long moment. Rebecca, I need you to understand what you're saying. Confronting Marcus would be extremely dangerous. He killed Catherine in a moment of rage, and there's no guarantee he wouldn't react violently if he felt threatened. If we do this, we need to have a solid plan, professional backup, and multiple safety measures in place. I nodded. I understand the risks, but I also understand that this might be my only chance to get justice for Catherine. If we just turn this over to the authorities, it could take years to resolve, and there's no guarantee of a conviction. If I can get him to confess, if I can record him admitting to what he did, that would be evidence that no defense attorney could dispute. Ray was quiet for several minutes, clearly weighing the options and considering the implications. Finally, he nodded. All right. If you're determined to do this, then we need to start planning immediately. But I want you to understand that this is going to be a complex operation that will require careful preparation and coordination. Over the next several hours, Ray outlined what would be involved in arranging a confrontation with Marcus. We would need to travel to Kansas, establish surveillance on his daily routine, and find a way to approach him without arousing suspicion. We would need recording equipment, backup personnel, and a detailed plan for every possible scenario. The key is to make Marcus believe that this is a chance encounter, Ray explained. If he thinks he's being deliberately hunted, he'll either run or become violent. We need to make it seem natural, coincidental, so that he doesn't feel immediately threatened. Ray suggested that I could approach Marcus at the garage where he worked, perhaps pretending to be a customer with car trouble. The garage was in a public location with other people around, which would provide some safety, and it would be a place where Marcus would feel comfortable and off guard. We'll need to set up surveillance first, Ray continued. We need to learn his routine, his habits, his patterns. We need to know when he's most likely to be alone, when he's most likely to be relaxed, when he's most likely to let his guard down. The planning process was both exciting and terrifying. For the first time since discovering Eleanor's letter, I felt like I was taking active steps toward justice for Catherine. But I also felt the weight of responsibility, the knowledge that I was about to confront the man who had killed my mother, and who might very well try to kill me too. Ray arranged for us to travel to Kansas the following week. He had contacts in the area who could provide support and assistance, and he had already begun gathering intelligence on Marcus's current life and circumstances. The man who had once been a violent, unstable killer had apparently transformed himself into a quiet, unremarkable mechanic who kept to himself and avoided attention. People change, Ray warned me, or at least they learn to hide their true nature better. Marcus has had 28 years to perfect his disguise, to become someone else entirely. Don't expect him to be the same raging, violent man who killed Catherine. He's probably learned to control his anger, to present a calm exterior. That might make him more dangerous, not less. As we prepared for the trip to Kansas, I found myself thinking constantly about Catherine and what she would want me to do. I reread her letters, looking for guidance and strength, and I found myself focusing on her words about courage and doing what was right even when it was difficult. In one letter, Catherine had written about her fear of Marcus, but also about her determination not to let that fear control her life. She had written about choosing to be brave not because she wasn't afraid, but because she was afraid and chose to act anyway. She had written about the importance of standing up to bullies and abusers, of not letting them win through intimidation and violence. Reading her words, I felt like Catherine was speaking directly to me, encouraging me to pursue justice for her death regardless of the personal cost. She had faced Marcus once, knowing that it might cost her life, and she had done it to protect me. Now it was my turn to face him, to speak for her, to make sure that her sacrifice had meaning. The night before we left for Kansas, I had dinner with Amy and told her about my plans. She was horrified by the idea of me confronting Marcus, worried about my safety, and skeptical about the likelihood of success. But she also understood my need to do this, my need to honor Catherine's memory and seek justice for her death. "Just promise me you'll be careful," Amy said as we hugged goodbye. "Promise me you won't take any unnecessary risks, and promise me you'll come home safely." I made that promise, even though I wasn't entirely sure I could keep it. I knew that confronting Marcus would be dangerous, that there was a real possibility that things could go wrong. But I also knew that I couldn't live with myself if I didn't try, if I let the man who had killed my mother continue living his life in peace while she lay in a grave. The flight to Kansas was turbulent, which seemed appropriate given the emotional turbulence I was experiencing. I spent the trip reading more of Catherine's letters, trying to absorb her strength and courage, trying to prepare myself for what lay ahead. By the time we landed in Wichita, I felt as ready as I could possibly be to face the man who had taken my mother's life. Ray had rented a car and booked us rooms at a motel about 30 miles from Millbrook. The drive to the small town took us through flat farmland and endless wheat fields, the kind of landscape that seemed to stretch on forever. Millbrook itself was exactly what I had expected, a small community with a single main street, a few shops and restaurants, and the kind of quiet atmosphere where everyone knew everyone else's business. The garage where Marcus worked was located on the outskirts of town, a simple building with 2 service bays and a small office. Ray and I drove past it several times, studying the layout and observing the patterns of activity. Marcus was there, working on various vehicles, looking for all the world like any other small-town mechanic. "There he is," Ray said as we watched from across the street. 28 years older, but still the same man who killed your mother. I stared at Marcus through the windshield, trying to reconcile this ordinary-looking man with the monster who had haunted my family for decades. He was older, grayer, more subdued than in the police photos, but I could still see the capacity for violence in his movements, the coiled tension that suggested he was always ready to strike. "Tomorrow," Ray said quietly. "Tomorrow we'll go in there and you'll get your chance to confront him. Are you ready for this, Rebecca?" I watched Marcus work for a few more minutes, thinking about Catherine and Eleanor and all the years of secrecy and pain that had led to this moment. I thought about the courage it had taken for Catherine to leave him, the love that had motivated her to give me away, and the ultimate price she had paid for trying to protect me. "I'm ready," I said finally. "I'm ready to speak for Catherine, to make sure Marcus knows that she's not forgotten, that her death has not been in vain. I'm ready to get justice for my mother." That night I barely slept, my mind racing with plans and possibilities and fears. Tomorrow I would come face to face with the man who had killed Catherine, and I would have the chance to honor her memory and seek justice for her death. It was the most terrifying and important thing I had ever done in my life, and I knew that Catherine would be with me every step of the way. The morning sun cast long shadows across the gravel parking lot of Peterson's Auto Repair as Ray and I sat in our rental car, watching Marcus through the open bay door. He was bent over the engine of a blue pickup truck, his movements methodical and practiced. It was strange to see him engaged in such ordinary work, this man who had destroyed so many lives, now simply earning a living like any other person in this quiet Kansas town. My hands trembled as I checked the recording device one more time. The small digital recorder was hidden in my purse, and I had a backup device clipped inside my jacket. Ray had positioned himself strategically in the parking lot, close enough to intervene if things went wrong, but far enough away to avoid arousing suspicion. We had rehearsed this moment dozens of times, but now that it was actually happening, I felt my carefully planned words slipping away. "Remember," Ray said quietly, "your goal is to get him talking. Don't accuse him directly at first. Let him think you're just another customer with car trouble. Once he's comfortable, you can gradually reveal who you are." I nodded, taking a deep breath and stepping out of the car. The recorder was running, capturing every sound as my feet crunched across the gravel. Marcus looked up as I approached, wiping his hands on a greasy rag, and I saw his face clearly for the first time. 28 years had changed him, adding lines around his eyes and gray to his hair, but the cold intelligence that had once terrified Catherine was still there. "Help you with something?" he asked, his voice gravelly from years of cigarettes. There was no recognition in his eyes, no indication that he saw anything familiar in my features. "I hope so," I replied, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "I'm having some trouble with my car. It's been making this strange noise, and I'm not sure what's causing it." Marcus nodded and gestured toward the car Ray and I had driven. "What kind of noise we talking about?" I launched into a fabricated story about engine troubles, watching his face carefully as he listened. He asked practical questions about the symptoms, suggested possible causes, and offered to take a look under the hood. For several minutes, we maintained the pretense of a normal customer interaction, but I could see him studying me with the same cold calculation that had once analyzed Catherine's weaknesses. "You're not from around here," he observed as he examined the engine. "Passing through? Actually, I'm here looking for information about someone," I said, deciding it was time to begin revealing my true purpose. "Someone who used to live in Virginia a long time ago." Marcus's hand stilled on the engine, and I saw his shoulders tense slightly. "Virginia's a long way from here. Don't know many people from back east." This person would have left Virginia suddenly, maybe under difficult circumstances. His name was Marcus Dalton. The wrench in Marcus's hand clattered to the ground, and he straightened slowly to face me. The transformation in his expression was immediate and frightening. The helpful mechanic facade disappeared, replaced by the predatory alertness of a dangerous animal sensing a threat. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice low and menacing. "My name is Rebecca Patterson," I said, meeting his gaze steadily. "But my real name is Rebecca Mills. Catherine Mills was my mother." The color drained from Marcus's face, and I saw his hands clench into fists at his sides. For a moment, I thought he might attack me right there in the garage, but instead he stepped back, looking around nervously as if checking to see who might be watching. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I think you do," I replied. "I think you remember Catherine very well. I think you remember the night you killed her." Marcus's breathing became rapid and shallow, and I could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "You need to leave," he said. "Get out of here right now." "I'm not going anywhere," I said, drawing strength from Catherine's memory. "Not until you tell me why you murdered my mother." Something snapped in Marcus's expression, and suddenly he was moving toward me with frightening speed. But before he could reach me, Ray appeared from behind a nearby car, his hand resting on his concealed weapon. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Marcus," Ray said calmly. "Or should I call you Michael Duncan?" Marcus stopped in his tracks, his eyes darting between Ray and me. "Who are you people? What do you want?" "We want the truth," I said. "We want you to admit what you did to Catherine." Marcus laughed bitterly. "You think you can just show up here after all these years and make me confess to something? You think I'm stupid?" "I think you're a coward," I said, feeling anger replace my fear. "I think you killed a woman who was trying to protect her child, and then you ran away and hid like the coward you are." The insult hit its mark, and Marcus's face flushed with rage. "Your mother was a lying, manipulative bitch who thought she could just walk away from me. She thought she could take my kid and disappear, but I found her. I always find what belongs to me." Ray and I exchanged glances. Marcus was admitting to tracking Catherine down, which was crucial evidence for our case. I wasn't your child, I said. Catherine left you because you were violent and dangerous. She was trying to protect me from you. Marcus's laugh was harsh and bitter. Protect you? She gave you away to strangers. What kind of protection is that? If she had just come back to me, if she had just done what she was supposed to do, she'd still be alive. So you admit you killed her, Ray said, stepping closer. Marcus seemed to realize he had said too much, and his expression became guarded again. I didn't say that. You said she'd still be alive if she had come back to you, I pressed. That means you know she's dead. How would you know that unless you were there? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his eyes calculating. Then, perhaps because he thought we couldn't prove anything, or perhaps because he was tired of carrying the secret, he began to speak. I went to that apartment to bring her home, he said. I'd been tracking her for months, following leads, talking to people who knew her. When I finally found her, I just wanted to talk. I wanted to work things out. But Catherine didn't want to work things out, I said. Marcus's face hardened. She was being stubborn, unreasonable. She kept saying she was done with me, that she'd never come back. She said she'd given the baby away to keep it safe from me, like I was some kind of monster. You were a monster, I said. You were violent and controlling, and Catherine was right to leave you. I never meant to hurt her, Marcus said, his voice becoming defensive. I loved her. I just wanted her to understand that we belonged together. But she wouldn't listen. She started screaming at me, threatening to call the police. I just wanted to make her stop, to make her listen. So you killed her, Ray said flatly. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring at the ground. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I grabbed her to make her stop yelling. I didn't mean to hurt her, but she fought back and I got angry. I squeezed too hard. When I let go, she wasn't moving anymore. The admission hung in the air between us. Recorded for posterity and justice, Marcus had just confessed to murdering Catherine, providing the evidence we needed to finally bring him to trial. 28 years, I said, my voice shaking with emotion. 28 years you've been free while my mother was dead and buried. 28 years you've been living your life while her family grieved for her. Marcus looked up at me, and for the first time I saw something that might have been remorse in his eyes. I never meant for any of this to happen. I loved Catherine. I would have given her everything. Love doesn't kill, I said. Love doesn't control and manipulate and destroy. What you felt for Catherine wasn't love. It was possession. Marcus seemed to deflate, the weight of his confession and the years of running finally catching up with him. So what happens now? Are you going to turn me in? That decision has already been made, Ray said, pulling out his phone. The Kansas State Police are on their way. You're going to be arrested and extradited back to Virginia to stand trial for Catherine's murder. Marcus nodded slowly, seeming almost relieved that his long flight from justice was finally over. I guess I always knew this day would come. I just hoped it wouldn't be so soon. Within minutes, we could hear sirens approaching. Marcus made no attempt to run or resist. He simply stood there in the garage, surrounded by the tools of his trade, waiting for the consequences of his actions to finally catch up with him. When the police arrived, Marcus was calm and cooperative. He didn't resist arrest, didn't try to recant his confession, didn't protest his innocence. As they led him away in handcuffs, he looked back at me one last time. I'm sorry, he said. I'm sorry for what I did to Catherine, and I'm sorry for what I took from you. I watched the police car disappear down the main street of Millbrook, taking Marcus away to face justice for Catherine's murder. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace settling over me. Justice had been served, not just for Catherine, but for everyone whose lives had been affected by Marcus's violence. Ray and I spent the rest of the day giving statements to the police and working with the prosecutor's office to ensure that Marcus's confession would be admissible in court. The legal process would take months, but we had the evidence we needed to secure a conviction. The flight back to Virginia gave me time to process everything that had happened. I had confronted the man who killed my mother, I had heard him admit to his crime, and I had seen him arrested and charged with murder. It was more than I had dared to hope for when I first found Eleanor's letter in the recipe box. But more than that, I had honored Catherine's memory and courage. I had spoken for her when she could no longer speak for herself. I had made sure that her death would not be forgotten, that her sacrifice would not be in vain. When I returned to Richmond, I felt like a different person than the woman who had left just days earlier. I had faced my fears, confronted danger, and emerged stronger and more determined than ever before. I had connected with my mother's memory in a way that no amount of letters or photographs could have provided. The trial took place 6 months later. Marcus pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. At the sentencing hearing, I was given the opportunity to make a victim impact statement. I spoke about Catherine's kindness, her creativity, her love for me and for life itself. I spoke about the sacrifice she had made to protect me, and about the 28 years of freedom that Marcus had stolen from her. Catherine Mills was more than just a murder victim, I said to the packed courtroom. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, and a mother. She was a woman who loved books and art and helping others. She was a woman who chose courage over safety, who chose love over fear, who chose to protect her child even when it cost her everything. Marcus listened to my statement, with tears in his eyes. When I finished speaking, he asked if he could respond. The judge allowed it, and Marcus stood to address the court. "I want to say that I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry for what I did to Catherine, and I'm sorry for the pain I caused her family. I know I can never make up for what I did, but I want Rebecca to know that her mother loved her more than anything in this world. Everything Catherine did, she did out of love for her daughter." After the trial, I returned to my life in Richmond, but everything had changed. I had a new understanding of who I was and where I came from. I had a connection to Catherine that went beyond genetics or shared traits. I had walked in her footsteps, faced her fears, and continued her fight for justice. I decided to leave my job as a high school English teacher and pursue a career in victim advocacy. I wanted to help other families who had lost loved ones to violence, to guide them through the legal process, and help them find justice and healing. It was a way to honor Catherine's memory and to use my experience to help others. Eleanor's recipe box sits on my kitchen counter now, but it's no longer just a collection of family recipes. It's a reminder of the secrets that families keep, the sacrifices that mothers make, and the power of truth to heal even the deepest wounds. When I make Eleanor's sugar cookies or Catherine's favorite apple crisp, I think about the women who came before me, who shaped my life through their love and courage. I've started writing letters to Catherine, following her example of putting thoughts and feelings down on paper. I tell her about my new career, about the families I've been able to help, about the ways her sacrifice continues to make a difference in the world. I tell her about the man I've started dating, a fellow advocate who understands the importance of justice and healing. I tell her about my plans for the future, about the family I hope to have someday, about the legacy of love and courage I want to pass on to my own children. Sometimes, late at night, I pull out Catherine's paintings and letters and feel her presence with me. I know that she's proud of the woman I've become, proud of the courage I found when I needed it most, proud of the way I honored her memory by seeking justice for her death. The recipe box that started this journey now holds more than just Eleanor's cooking instructions. It holds Catherine's letters, photographs from my meeting with Linda and James, copies of legal documents from Marcus's trial, and my own journal entries about this incredible journey of discovery and healing. Most importantly, it holds the recipe for something that can't be measured in cups and teaspoons. It holds the recipe for courage, for justice, for love that transcends death and time. It holds the recipe for a life lived with purpose and meaning, a life that honors the sacrifices of those who came before us. When I look at Catherine's painting hanging on my living room wall, I no longer see it as a reminder of what I lost. I see it as a celebration of what I found: a mother's love, a family's courage, and the strength to face whatever challenges life might bring. Catherine's legacy lives on, not just in me but in every person I help, every family I guide toward justice, every life that's made better, because she chose love over fear. The recipe book that seemed so ordinary when I first pulled it from Eleanor's closet had contained the most extraordinary gift of all: the truth about who I am, and the courage to honor the woman who gave me life. And that, I know, is exactly what both Catherine and Eleanor would have wanted. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.